The division of revenue bill only does a simple thing. It divides money that will be spent by the national government and the other monies that will be spent by the counties. And then, as I said on the other issue of BPS and estimates, then there is another one called the county allocation of revenue bill. It now borrows from the division of revenue. Division of revenue sets a block figure. Now this is the monies that are going to counties. And then the other of county revenue now divides, using the CRI formula, the monies that goes to specific counties. And in between there, of course, Senate comes in between. Now, allow me now to go to generalities. I just needed to say those things because they'll be flying in the air many times as we make or in the process of budget making. Allow me now to say some general things, and then we go to the plenary. We are making the budget. What majority of members ask is, nini iko hapo ya kwangu? Which is there for my county? What is in it for me? I want to give the general view of the condition at which we are making the current budget, so that even as we ask in regards to what is there for me, we know at what conditions we are operating. Number one, allow me to reference the current budget of this financial year. This current budget, and I wish I had somewhere to write so that I demonstrate, but I'll write in the air. The current budget would have an idea the amount of money we had proposed to spend in this budget. Anyone? Even generally or approximately? Someone? Honorable Faramari? 3 trillion. Somebody else? Member for Karachonyo is 3.1. Another attempt? Yeah? Honorable Kaluma is 2 trillion. Sonkoya is more approximate. 3.3 trillion. Now, 3.3 trillion, please go with me so that we understand. What do you want to write? And I'm demonstrating. I don't want to present a very formal speech. 3.3 trillion. When we make the budget, it has the supply side of money and it has the demand side of money. We have the money supply coming into the basket, and we have the money demand taking off the basket. Let's first interrogate the supply side of money. Honorable Kemani Kuria, that is his domain. But because I have the privilege to have the mic now, we can interrogate. This current budget, what is the supply side of money? Number one, if you can write together. Who would have an idea about the revenues we are supposed to collect this financial year? Anyone? Saudi Menti? Dr. Mwiti? How much? How much? Honorable Muruidania? 1.7. Another attempt? Very good. Sonkoya? 2.2. Both of you are right, approximately. And you'd rather be approximately correct than exactly incorrect. So if you have 2.16, that is the revenues we are getting from KRA. These are the taxes. And then we have 3.3. What are the other sources of filling the basket? The other sources of filling the basket, number one is ordinary revenue, 2.16. The number two, which is the highest number two, actually that number, it is the third highest currently. It is something we call A in A. That is another jargon I want to demystify. We call appropriations in aid. When people hear appropriations in aid, honestly, you would almost, the first name that comes to your mind is first aid. Because, it sounds technical. appropriations in aid is basically a government MDA receives money. Now, this is it. The money received at source, let's say a fine somewhere, let's say some charges in a government hospital, let's say fees in a university. This is what is called appropriations in aid. Now, in this current budget, it is 300 billion Kenya shillings. Are we okay up to there? Now, that is 2.46 trillion. Which is the other source? The other source is grants. Grants currently we are talking about 33 billion Kenya shillings. If you do the math on the supply side of money, you see there is a gap of 862 billion. That is what we call budget deficit. Because we have made a budget, we are supposing or proposing to spend more money than we have. In this case scenario, we are proposing to spend 862 billion more than we actually have. Now, let's interrogate first the demand side of money so that we come to the specifics as I wind up. The demand side of money, this is money in a basket. And I want you to, especially as rural folks, when you're in your compound, you throw some maize to your chicken, then they are scrabbling. Within a minute, there is no money anymore on or in your compound. That is actually how I see the budget. Now, this is the basket. People are competing for their needs. The number one need we are competing for is what we call salaries. So salaries in Kenya currently is approximately 800 billion to 900 billion Kenya shillings. That is the entire salaries combined. The other expenditure is recurrent non-salaries. The money that you are paid to fuel your vehicle, the hours that are bought in a government office, the monies for travel, that is recurrent non-salary. That is now currently around 600 billion Kenya shillings. Now, KJ, thank you very much. There is another thing called, before we come to that, development. Development in this financial year, we are talking about 715 billion Kenya shillings. Then KJ has come up with another explanation. International obligation. They are actually not just international obligations. This is now the fourth. The first one I said salaries. Second one recurring and salaries. Third one I said development. The fourth one is another jargon we throw around called CFS. CFS, what is CFS? This is usually actually almost not almost, it should be the first charge. This is where we pay our debts. And in this current financial year, we are talking about 800 to 900 billion Kenya shillings going to CFS. What is CFS? CFS is the money we pay our debts, the monies we pay our pensions, the monies we pay our commissions, because our commissions should actually be operating as independent governments. And that is why their money should come faster even before our own salaries. And then the last thing is the transfer to counties. This financial year, we are talking about 370 billion Kenya shillings. If you do the math this side and the math the other side, you will see 3.3 trillion this side and 3.3 trillion this side. Are we together up to there? I hope I'm not talking to myself. Or consolidated fat services. That is CFS. Sorry. I thought I'm only speaking to Honorable Kimani Shongwa, and Honorable Badi, who have been members of the committee. Yeah. So now, I'm trying to demolish the jargons around budget so that we see it in real terms. Now, this deficit is the one I first want to talk about, the 862 billion Kenya shillings. This is the deficit. And the build-up of the deficit is what we call now the national debt. The accumulation of these deficits, because they keep on increasing, they now crystallize to become what we call public debt. What is the current public debt in Kenya? The current public debt in Kenya is, let's say, around 10 trillion Kenya shillings. 50% is domestic and 50% is foreign. Now, this debt, when Tom Kahn was presenting, you saw that the United States of America has a debt portfolio of around 100% of their own GDP, because it is at 31 trillion USD. If you do now percentage-wise to the economy, it comes to around 100%. So people may argue, by the way, the Kenyan debt to GDP ratio is then much way below the US. It is actually much way below that of Japan at 250%. It is even much higher than the UK. Then you might ask, watu wanasubua sisi kwa nini? We have a very huge leeway to borrow. Now, why then did the president give a directive that we have to be a bit modest? We have to be cognizant that we are crossing the red line. Why is that so? And yet the US is much way ahead of us. Why? Debt is good and debt is bad. In our case, there are several things to consider, because all these things will be interrogating them in Parliament. The number one thing to consider, yes, the debt to GDP ratio in Kenya is recorded at around 70-something%. US is 100, Japan 250. Number one thing is cost. How much is the debt that we have actually accumulated in terms of cost? What is the cost of our debt? When we go to the market today to borrow, what is our cost? The cost in Kenya, the board that was given recently by the Treasury, exempt of taxes, was around 13%. Exempt of taxes. A 10-year bond in the US is much lower. In fact, before the interventions made by the Fed this year, by raising the Fed rate around 6 times this year, before that, it was in the range of 1.something% to 2%. Yeah. The lawyer is asking whether I'm talking Swahili or Greek. But I hope you are getting. Or the Fed is the Federal Reserve, our equivalent of central bank. The CBR rate is the Fed rate. Now, number one is cost. The Japanese debt, at some point, the Japanese debt, they were actually borrowing at negative rate. Now, that is number one issue of cost. Number two is currency. When the US borrows, they borrow in their currency. When Japan borrows, most of it is actually internal. They borrow from themselves, and therefore it is yen denominated. Now, our debt is usually dollar denominated. When dollar loses by only 1%, our external debt currently is around 5 trillion Kenya shillings, 4-point-something. So a variation of a dollar by 1%, it means a 50 billion dent in our debt portfolio without borrowing a shilling. That is the other thing. The third point I want to give about debt is something I would call net off. Net off is what? Kenya, we borrow, we do not lend. The US borrows, but it also lends. Japan, as we talk, is the highest indebted economy in the world in terms of GDP, debt to GDP ratio, but Japan is the number one lender to the US. It is the number one. In the debt portfolio of the US, Japan is actually number one. Therefore, when we talk and try to justify debt, all those are not working for us. And therefore, comparing Kenya to Japan and the US is considering or it's comparing a Norwich and a donkey. Something totally out of the ordinary in terms of comparisons. Now, I'm trying to be brief, and I'm actually almost done. Revenues. The president has been saying this many times. Ordinary revenue is the most reliable in all countries. Now, we are getting around 2.16 trillion Kenya shillings from KRA to the basket of money. But our peers, middle-level economies of the world, their percentage is hovering around 20% to 25%. Somebody can do the math for me. The Kenyan GDP is 14 trillion. I will request Honorable Mary Maingi, to do this math for me through his calculator. Her calculator. If Kenyan GDP is 14 trillion Kenya shillings, our revenues currently is around 14 to 15% of our GDP. If we collected the revenues just the same way our peers are collecting, at 25%, do 25% of 14 trillion. How much is that? Actually, that is 3.5 trillion. What does that mean? If we just collect revenues of what economies like us are collecting in their economies, Kenya would be reading a surplus budget. If we collect revenues equivalent to what South Africa is collecting, at 28.6%, we'll be collecting 4 trillion this year. And therefore, we have a big scope in terms of revenue collection. Let me just say something around inflation, because I said I'm talking about general terms, and I sit. And I talk about inflation because the backdrop at which we are making this budget, high food prices, a country that is indebted, and of course, mismatch between revenue and expenditure. So what is this thing we keep on referring to as inflation? Inflation is when I go to a kiosk and I get that unga has moved from this price upwards. It is the general rise in prices comparatively. You compare now this season, like last year a time like this, and this year a time like this. That general rise in prices is what we call inflation. Why am I talking about inflation? I'm talking about inflation because that is what we are facing in Kenya currently. The people we represent, that is one of the issues that are very hard on them. But what causes this inflation? What causes it? Inflation can be caused by two things. Number one, we always see the Fed. The Fed has been raising their interest rate almost every month, some several basis points. Our CBK here has been raising our base lending rate now to around, who could be knowing at what point we are now at? No, CBR. Who has an idea? By a show of hand. Not 8.9, 8 point something. All right. Let's work with 8.25. Why has the central bank been raising the rates? And on the other side, they say they are containing inflation. Why has the Fed been raising interest rates? And they say they are containing inflation. It is because, number one side of inflation is caused by supply of money. Let me demonstrate. You have a kiosk here selling 10 bales of unga ya ugali. This kiosk has 10 bales of unga ya ugali. It is in Ndhiwa somewhere. Now, Mheshimiwa goes to that place and leaves something. You know what I mean? That something now has its own velocity of moving around the kijiji. So everyone now goes to demand unga from the same kiosk. Now people have more money. And the supply of unga in this kiosk is the same. So what does the shopkeeper do? Anaona watu wanapaga line to buy the same unga. And because they are there for business, they raise the prices. That is one form of inflation. The way to arrest it is to make sure that you mop out all this money from these people's pockets so that you suppress demand. That is now one side of inflation. The other side of inflation is what the entire globe is facing. It is inflation caused by disruption in supply chains. When now this kiosk of unga you have the same money in this kijiji, but then where this shopkeeper goes to buy unga, he's told the lorry that brings the unga developed mechanical problems, and therefore, instead of 10 bales, they now only have 2 bales. But the demand is the same. So that is now inflation caused by disruption in supply chain. That is why we have, at some point around 1.5 years ago, the price of uga ya ngano went up, the price of uga ya ugali went up, because Russia and Ukraine were accounting for around 30% of the world export of corn and around 20% of the world export of wheat. And now that is what we call inflation, generally speaking. Otherwise, members, I would want to leave it there so that you also engage. Thank you very much and for listening to us.
Another round of applause for Honorable NDINDI. Honorable members, you realize it's almost dinner time, 8 minutes to 7 p.m. So I would pray that we wrap up today's agenda. Let me see by show of hands. When you ask a question, you direct it to either Tom, Phyllis, or NDINDI. I will start with Thaddeus, Honorable Thaddeus. I will come to Honorable Kimani Ichung'wah. Then I will go to Ward Chief, Honorable Ward Chief, then Honorable Raso in the first round. Then we'll take another final one.
Thank you, Chair. And NDINDI, congratulations for your good presentation. My question goes directly to Phyllis. I'll be very brief on it. I'm Junior Zambia, Member of Parliament, Kilome constituency. Phyllis, you've engaged us on the issues of budget, and you've talked of unrealistic revenue projections. Just from where you are seated, who is responsible for this, and how can we avoid it? Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Kimani Ichung'wah.
Thank you. Mine goes to Tom, because I noticed in the US, both the Senate and the House of Commons are involved in the budget-making process. And it's at a point where you spoke about conferences, budget conferences, in the processing of the bills, the 12 bills. What happens in the case where the two houses do not agree on a particular bill? How are you able to resolve that? Two, maybe also from your experience in the US, is there any value that you have seen in the involvement of the Senate? And I know your constitutional architecture might be slightly different from ours, but is there any value in having the Senate being involved in the budget-making process there? Lastly, I think is just a comment, not really a question, on what you say, that a challenge to us that we be willing to cast unpopular votes. And you say that is why we are elected. And I think that is very good advice coming from you, because we have that experience here where we are often unable to make those very unpopular decisions. And members, those who are with us in the last parliament, you remember the finance bill of 2018 or 2019, Phyllis, on the fuel, VAT on fuel. And the demonstrations were bigger than those of CDF last week. Yeah. And eventually, we are paying the price now. And in fact, the cost of fuel today is much higher than it would have been then. Therefore, we have our own learnings, and maybe it's good to hear that also coming from the US, not just here. On the question of unrealistic revenue estimates that Phyllis spoke about, and she knows we have been there with the Honorable John Buddy, and you know the position we always took. But I think, I don't know what we would be able to do as Parliament, because that's the beginning of all the problems. These are problems you're talking about debt. It begins from the unrealistic revenue estimates, and even the issues of pending bills. I don't know what Phyllis, now from your experience, and we've been there with you, and you know what we had to go through. Fortunately, maybe we may have a more pragmatic government this time that will be more willing to listen. But what can Parliament do to ensure that the estimates are as realistic or as close to the reality as possible.
On a board, Chief there.
Thank you, Speaker. My question goes to Cardinal NDINDI, NYORO, and Macau. This animal we call pending bill. We are practicing budget-based, program budget-based, and in it, all of it are itemized to the little bit. That means when